So how should you be seasoning your cast iron skillet or pan? At what temperature should you be seasoning them? What kind of oil should you be using? And is there anything that you should look out for? In today's video, I want to give you guys a general guide to get you started. Talk over some important things that you should be considering. Also go over some different methods of seasoning cast iron. This also works for carbon steel. And talk about things that you should personally look out for. Let's dive in. Okay, so let's start off with what is seasoning and what are you trying to accomplish? This is really crucial. You have to understand what you're trying to do. It's actually not to get a non-stick surface. That's actually a secondary benefit. When it comes to cast iron and carbon steel, the number one reason you season your pans, the main purpose is to prevent the pans from rust or oxidation, bad oxidation. So it's a protective layer more than anything else. But because it's highly effective at reducing the chances of getting rust in everyday normal cooking techniques, it also gives you a byproduct of giving you a polymerized surface, which makes it pretty non-stick. And the better that surface gets as you use it, just using it naturally, the more non-stick the pan gets. So that's the number one reason behind seasoning. It's actually not to get a non-stick surface. It's to protect the pots and pans. I also wanted to kind of touch up on another thing. The trend with new pans is they're going to come factory seasoned. Is the factory seasoning any good? Yes and no. So Lodge, for example, is notorious for giving you factory pre-seasoning, right? And it's fine. It's actually good. If you wanted to just kind of go with that, I still recommend that you wash the pans, clean them, because there could be other stuff from the manufacturing process that you don't necessarily want in your food. But I mean, generally speaking, yeah, if you just went with it and used them properly, you should be fine, and then you're going to create your own seasoning on top of that. There's also seasoning that comes like this. This particular cast iron pan is from Cook Life. I've actually done a full video on this guy, and I compared it to Lodge. I do think that these are higher quality. They do offer more. They also come with a milled surface that's perfectly smooth, and we'll talk about that. But this is kind of a different process. This is like almost anodized, right? At the price point that you're paying, you would expect something like this. It's actually really, really good. So this is probably the best pre-seasoning I've seen on almost any pan. Different types of pre-seasonings. Generally speaking, if you don't like the way it looks, visually examine it, sand it off, and start over. There's absolutely nothing wrong with doing that. So let's talk about some pre-seasoning techniques that you should be aware of. So I think there's two main methods. Right now we're going to talk about the techniques, and in those techniques I'm going to split them up into the oven method and the stovetop method. Within those two techniques, there's actually, for the oven method, there's two different ways of doing it, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit later. But first, let me just talk about what those techniques kind of are, right? So the first one's the most popular. The oven method. Highly recommend it for cast iron in particular because the entire thing is cast iron, including the handle. So the entire pan or pot is oven safe, which gives you a great opportunity to coat the entire pan in whatever oil you want to use. And we're going to talk about oil a little bit later, and put the entire thing in the oven to give a polymerized coating for the entirety of the pan, which will protect the entire pan. Now, that is probably my preferred method for seasoning cast iron. Not only is it highly effective at protecting the pan, but it's also really easy to do, and it's almost set it and forget it. I mean, just use a timer or something to remind you, and you should be good to go. You want to use oil that is better at polymerizing than other oils. Preferably, I am a firm believer in using high smoke point oil. Now, not super high. You don't have to go out and buy avocado oil that has a smoke point of 550 degrees that costs you like $50, you know, a liter. So I don't know, right? Like, you don't need to do that. But, you know, I like using like grapeseed oil or sunflower seed oil, something that has a fairly high smoke point, 400, 450 degrees, something like that. And then you basically coat a very thin layer, and you just get some oil with a paper towel, rub it all around the pan, and then you want to stick the pan inside of the oven. Now, I told you that there's two different methods, and there is. Like anything else in cooking, everything is a factor of both temperature and time. You can polymerize oil in two different ways. You can take the oil just past its smoking point and then let it bake for at least 45 minutes to an hour. For example, let's say grapeseed oil that has a smoking point of 425 degrees, right? Lightly coat it around your pan, stick the pan in a preheated oven. The oven temperature should be about 450 degrees, right? It's really important to use a gauge or something to actually get accurate temperatures because your oven does lie to you, right? You want something to actually measure things, but you'll know when you're doing it right because you should see the pan, the oil, just starting to smoke. A light smoke, right? You should see light smoke, you should smell some smoke, but nothing crazy. It should not be setting off fire alarms, right? Smoke detectors. The second method, again, going back to temperature and time, you can actually take the oil under its smoking point, just under. So if you're using grapeseed oil that has a smoking point of 425 degrees, doing it at 400 degrees or even 390 degrees. But the difference here is you have to let it go for longer, right? Temperature and time. So instead of sticking it in the oven for an hour, you should probably let it go for at least 3 hours. The oil will polymerize. Eventually the oil will polymerize. I don't really like this method for two reasons. One, it's longer and I'm impatient. Two, you don't really get a sense that it's working, at least not right away. So with the first method, you can see it smoking, right? You can see visually that something's going on. You can smell it. With the second method, you can be, in an hour and a half or so, and you have no idea if it's actually working or not, right? You can be in there 2 hours and you have no idea if it's actually working or not, and you just kind of wasted your time. And then, 3 hours, 3 hours and a half, boom, now it starts to work and it actually gave the oil enough time to polymerize, right? So you have to kind of check it more periodically, but also the more that you open up the oven and that temperature drops, the more likely you're going to make errors. That's basically what I'm saying. The entire process is a little bit more error prone. And honestly, both methods are going to get you there, but the first method going just past the smoking point, I've always used that and it's always worked. 2, the second method is actually borrowed from cast iron. Again, there's 2 stovetop methods, right? I'm going to give you a 2.1 and a 2.2. The first one's actually called the potato peel method. You grab a bunch of potato peels, right? Peel off some potatoes, and then dump a bunch of oil inside with salt and the potatoes, and that starch from the potatoes is actually going to give your cast iron pan kind of like a warm-up, right? With the oil baking in there and seasoning the inside of the pan. Now, you probably guessed it. Works great for the inside of the pan, but you're not really adding a huge protective layer, right, around the entire pan, like the oven method. If your pan already came pre-seasoned, you might feel like, hey, everything's fine on the protection side of things, and I just want to work on that inside seasoning, right, and get that non-stick coating to be a little bit better, or just kickstart your pan, then the potato peel method's good. The other method is skipping the potato peels and the salt, because that's really for like cleaning carbon steel pans, because carbon steel pans are notorious for having this wax, this protective wax that they put on there during the shipping process to protect them, and that's usually hard to get out. So having the salt, the abrasive, the potato peels, and so forth really works well. So the second method is literally just putting in some oil, a lot of oil, not, a huge amount, but like you'll be surprised, a quarter of this, and then letting that oil heat up past its smoking point on the stovetop. So you are going to take it past its smoking point, but you don't want to go crazy. It, again, shouldn't be setting off smoke detectors, but you should be seeing smoke just starting to come out from your pan. How long you should do it for? That's a good question. So it's a little bit more dangerous, quote unquote. You have a lot of oil on top of a stovetop. If you have a gas stovetop, there's an open flame, so there's definitely higher risk for a grease fire. So a lot of folks will tell you like 10, 15, 20 minutes tops, and that's it. The other part to that is there's too many variables, right? How much oil are you putting in there? Are you actually getting the entire surface, right? Do you want the walls to? Are you using a gas stovetop? Is it an induction stovetop where you can absolutely get super accurate with the temperature? Electric stovetop, right? Stovetops are all different. Some are more accurate than others. You can see there's a lot of variables to deal with. So for cast iron, again, inside the oven, if you want to do the stovetop method, I would recommend that you really heavily consider it for cast iron, but I still like the potato peel method, to be honest with you. And you're kind of cleaning out anything that would have been in there, right, from the manufacturer. So, you know, weigh it out and figure out what's best for you. Okay, so as promised, what about the oil? What kind of oil should you use? What do I personally use? Again, I'm gonna be honest and upfront with you guys. There's many different methods out there. You can basically season with almost any fat. I mean, there's people that season with lard, oil, you name it, right? Avoid things like butter or olive oil that have very low smoking points. I'm gonna talk about smoking point and why I think you should go with a higher smoking point or a medium, right, level smoking point. But to get to the point, you have saturated fats oil and unsaturated fats. Unsaturated fats tend to polymerize and bond a little bit better than saturated fats. So again, going back to like olive oil, for example, olive oil doesn't necessarily do a good job of polymerizing when you're used in seasoning, right? It tends to be a little sensitive and flaky. But avocado oil tends to do a little bit better, right? Now, should you use avocado oil, which is very expensive? I personally think no. There's other oils that you can use. But generally speaking, you want to avoid things like vegetable oil, corn oil, right? Things that won't be as stable for the seasoning process. I've always loved using either sunflower or grapeseed, and they've always worked perfectly for me. They have just the amount of blend of saturated versus unsaturated fats and other things that go into it. But generally speaking, cheap, good smoking point, readily available, and they've always just worked well for me. Now, you can use lard if you want to. I've heard of people seasoning with ghee. I mean, I've never tried it. Ghee can have a high smoking point, so that'd be interesting if you guys have before. Leave me a comment below. I'd love to hear from you guys. And generally speaking, I mean, I'd love to hear what you guys do. People have some methods that have been passed down to them from their grandparents that just absolutely work. So why do I personally recommend a higher smoke point? Look, it just comes down to, at least my engineering mind, this is how my mind works, logic, right? If I'm going to be using my pan in high heat scenarios, then I want to make sure that I'm polymerizing the oil at a relatively high heat, right? So it just makes it more stable, because yes, you can damage the seasoning by going too hot. If you don't believe me, take your favorite cast iron pan that's perfectly seasoned and shove it in a campfire. Now, the pan's going to be fine. The cast iron pan can definitely handle it, the material, but you'll see that the seasoning will start developing micro cracks. That's because you took it way past its smoking point, like anything else, right? Everything has its breaking point. So if you are seasoning a little lower, right, at a lower smoking point, let's say 350 degrees Fahrenheit, or maybe 375, something like that, but you're constantly taking your pan to searing levels, right? 500 degrees, 475, 500 degrees, 520, right? 550. You can see that, you know, you might start developing micro cracks. So I feel like being at a happy 425, 450, that's going to give me the best results. And I'm never going to take my pan to like 650, 700, 800 degrees Fahrenheit on a stovetop, right? Things are different when you're in a controlled environment like an oven where it's getting equal amounts of heat, right? But like extreme temperature searing, stovetop, maybe induction. Induction is a good example. Or campfire. Those are extreme cases where you could crack the seasoning. Absolutely, I've seen it. Okay, now let's talk about some troubleshooting and common mistakes. The most important thing is to get that base seasoning, right? Maybe the first 2 layers, right? Because you'll never have a perfect layer, 1 layer of seasoning. There's a reason why they pre-season them at least twice, even 3 times from the manufacturer. Anything that doesn't get filled up by that first layer will get filled up by the second layer, and the more layers that you have, the better the odds are of protecting your pan, because there's always going to be micro holes. I mean, that's just, it's going to happen. It's never going to be perfect. Now, I don't think you should go overboard. I've seen people go like 10, 12, 15 layers where this thing's like a mirror. I don't think you need that. I would season at least twice
and then just start using the pan like crazy. The best cast iron cookware I've ever seen was used day in and day out, and they were absolute heirlooms. So just use your pan. Now, common troubleshooting mistakes. Your pan's dirty. You started seasoning and it wasn't clean to begin with, and you may have not had a clean, even surface. It might be an older pan, or you might have sanded it, right? Or got it from the manufacturer and it was dirty. If it's dirty, when you went to go apply that thin layer of oil, well, there was crud in it. So how can it polymerize if there was crap in it and that oil can't bond with the surface, right? So always clean your pan. Likewise, when you are applying that thin coat of oil, if you're using like dish towels, right, or napkins leave residue. That residue is impeding the seasoning process. So try to use something that's lint-free, right? And inspect your pan. If you see that it's dirty, then clean it up, reapply the oil. Make sure that foundation layer is good. Then everything else, on top of that will be fine. By the way, this is all going to apply to the oven method because I think that's going to be the more popular route. But the second method that I see people doing is they put way too much oil. Instead of putting down a thin layer and wiping it down and making sure you have thin oil to properly polymerize things, there's way too much, right? It's uneven, it's kind of like blotchy, and there's too much in certain areas and it's dripping in other areas. If you see actual like goo dripping and things like that, you put way too much. It's a good idea to put a catch pan underneath when you're doing the oven method, but there should not be a pool of oil underneath. So make sure you have a nice, thin, consistent layer all around. The other mistake I see people doing is not taking the oil past its smoking point if you're doing that method, or if you're going under the smoking point, not letting it season for a longer duration of time, not giving the pan and the oil enough time to properly bond, and then let the pan cool inside the oven. So shut off your oven and let everything cool and relax together. That is one seasoning process. And the last method is using the wrong fat or oil. I've had people message me saying like, hey, I've tried to season with butter and I want to use butter. I like butter, right? And it's just not seasoning. I'm getting a lot of smoke. No, butter has a lot of water in it, so you're not necessarily seeing smoke, you're seeing steam. That butter is smoking heavily because the water's evaporating, and the butter is not going to do a very good job of seasoning your cast iron pan. So use the right type of oil. Avoid olive oil. I've heard people message me and go, hey, I'm using olive oil, that's all that I had, and it's not working properly, right? Or I used corn oil, I'm not happy with the results, right? Now, the very last thing I want to talk about is, what about a smooth surface versus a rough surface? Well, again, that has different pros and cons. I prefer a smooth surface because I'm a huge carbon steel fan, but I've had large cast iron pans that have the rough surface from the factory, and they're fine. They still work very well. Here's what I've found, right? When it comes to seasoning, the rough surface actually takes the seasoning a little bit better. It does. There's pores, there's bigger pores, there's more areas for the oil to kind of bond. The best analogy I can give you is when you're gluing something, right? When you're gluing two things together. What do the manufacturers usually have in their instructions? They suggest that you clean the area and rough them up a little bit with sandpaper to allow the two areas to bond properly. So that kind of makes sense when you have a little bit of a rougher surface finish. And I've seen it. It does bond a little bit better, but also it doesn't clean as nicely, right? When it comes time to clean out your pan, because it's a little bit rougher, things tend to kind of get in the little areas a little bit more, and things tend to stick a little bit more, just a tad bit more, because it's a rougher area, right? So it's not even and smooth. I've found that when it comes time to getting a proper nonstick feel, I prefer the smoother surface finishes. Actually, why I like carbon steel so much, but they're also easier to clean afterwards. So personal preference. So that's basically it, guys. I hope you guys found this video informative. And again, if you guys have recommendations or questions for me, please leave a comment below. Catch you in the next video.